I'm Mike Browne, Executive Editor of Supermarket News. We've been hearing a lot in the past week or so about issues with the U.S. food supply chain, particularly the meat supply in the face of a number of meat plant closures due to safety issues and outbreaks of coronavirus. Last week, we saw the president of Tyson Foods issue a public announcement that the food supply chain is broken. And later in the week, President Trump issued an executive order that the nation's meat plants are essential businesses and steps must be taken to ensure that they stay open and remain safe for employees. Today, I'm here with Abe Eshkenazi, the CEO of the Association for Supply Chain Management, who certainly has some thoughts and expertise on the subject. Welcome, Abe.
Morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm good. So what was your reaction and the reaction of your membership to the statement from Tyson Foods about this food supply chain being broken? It was a pretty dramatic statement that they made last week.
Yeah, I think we have to put ourselves in their shoes first to understand some of the challenges that organization is going through. From their perspective, they are seeing a significant challenge relative to the employees and making sure that they're providing a safe environment. So I understand, and I think we can empathize with him that from his perspective, he's dealing with a significant challenge. From our perspective, we don't think it's broken as much as it is stressed. The supply chains, almost every supply chain has been stressed because of this pandemic to a small or a large extent, obviously depending on the industry that you're in. When we're talking about a disruption to the supply chain, whether on an input, raw materials or labor, or on the processing, meaning the plants or the warehousing or the storage of these particular products, any disruption, any increase or decrease in the inputs or the amount of the resource that you have to apply to it will have an impact on the entire supply chain. The interconnectedness of the activities, whether it be the raw material, labor, processing, warehousing, logistics, distribution, all of those are critical to an effective and efficient supply chain. When you take out labor, one of the most significant aspects of the supply chain, you're going to have a significant disruption within the supply chain. So I think we can understand that from Tyson's perspective, they're dealing with a new and unforeseen break in their services. But I think we also have seen that it takes time for supply chains to respond. So I don't know that they're as much broken as they are stressed right now for the food supply chain.
Okay. How do we go about reassuring the American public, though, when we see statements like that? The last thing we need is another round of panic buying and hoarding like we saw in March. And some ways that seems to be already happening with the meat category.
Yeah, I think we're entering a different frontier now relative to food right now, and that's food scarcity. We started to see it in the beginning of the pandemic with consumer packaged goods, specifically toilet paper and paper towels. We saw a significant run on those particular products. But what we've also seen is that the supply chain has responded to those gaps in the supply for those particular items. So it's taken a while for the supply chains to respond to the spike in demand, but it's also critical that we recognize that this is a spike. This is not a new demand signal at that level. When we take a look at utilization, we're not looking at an increase in terms of food or in consumer packaged goods. So we've still got the same mouths to feed and the same bottoms to wipe as we had 2 or 3 months ago. It's just that we're seeing a shift in terms of where the demand is being sensed right now, and that is in a home-based environment. So it takes time for the system to recover. What we may experience in the short term is a reduction or a stock out in certain products. So you may have a reduction in the variety of the particular products. So the consumers may have to take a second or third choice on their particular product or the meat category. But it does take time for the system to respond. And I think we can use our South Dakota example as a system that was completely shut down. And now, as of, I believe, Monday of this week, they're starting production again. So as we're seeing plants, whether it be in South Dakota or the Tyson plants, seeing some disruption in their capacity to produce, you'll see others come online and come offline. So I think we're in a period right now where you're going to see some stockouts, where you're going to see some changes in terms of buying behavior or availability of the products. but the system will catch up. It just takes a little time for not only the organizations, the companies, to ensure that they have a safe working environment, but also for the employees to feel like they can come back and provide it. That's going to align with and hopefully address the consumer in terms of their perception of scarcity. And I think that's what drives the majority of the panic buying, is this perception that I'm not going to be able to get it. And I think we all need to take a step back and start to consider more on the greater good as opposed to the individual good. There'll be more than enough protein and meat products. It's just that it may take a shift in terms of the variety in the short term and the quantity as well, but the system will catch up to the new demand as also the new utilization in a home-based environment versus restaurants, convention centers, or work settings.
Some retailers have started limits on the amount of meat that customers can buy. So that sort of goes into your thoughts about the customer perception of shortages. Do you think that these limits sort of, I mean, obviously they ease the situation from a logistics standpoint, but do they lead to more of a sense of panic about the supply chain in the eyes of a consumer?
Yeah, I think you've got a double-edged sword here. I think we've got a supply issue, obviously, because of the production capacity being reduced. So we're going to have reduced quantity on the shelf for a lot of the products that individuals, or some of the products that individuals and consumers are looking for. So they may have to take second and third choices, but rationing and or quotas will help in the short term. As the system catches up, I think we'll see an easing of that. But it also does present a problem because the quotas are not relative to family size. They're relative to the buyer. So a family of 5 or 6 has the same quota as a family of 2. So we have to be aware of the current circumstances that these individuals are facing. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So quotas may help in the short term as we start to ramp up production and then see availability and variety start to increase. In the short term, that can have sort of a buffering effect on a run to ensure that there is enough for everybody, or that there's some for everybody. It may not be in the quantity and they may not be in the variety that they want, but it also does provide a much broader availability to more consumers.
Okay. Shifting a little bit to the processing side, and how can meat manufacturers and all food processors really, what can they do to keep their employees safe and their facilities operating and the supply chain flowing?
I think every employer wants to be in business. I don't think there's an employer out there or an employee that does not want to be back on the job. So this is a joint effort between the employer, the employees, as well as the standards and policies that organizations are complying with, whether it be OSHA standards, CDC, or public health requirements on what appropriate distancing, what appropriate, operations may be in terms of individuals getting back into a work setting. Obviously, within the meat packing and the processing industry, there have been some challenges on workplace safety. This is an entirely different challenge for a lot of organizations because these are fairly tight quarters for a lot of these organizations in terms of the way the systems are set up and the way that the lines are set up. So are they able to shift some of their manufacturing into perhaps different shifts that employees are coming at different times and are spacing themselves out? So you won't have full capacity, but you'll have some capacity. Are you able to change the lines? Put them in a Z format as opposed to a linear format, again, to separate. The requirements for a safe and healthy work environment have been established by not only federal as well as local agencies, but I would assume that every employer has their own policies on worker safety. I would just say that we need to comply, not only with federal, but with local standards as well, to ensure that individuals coming on the job are in a safe environment and that they can work without fear of contracting either a pandemic, disease or virus, or other physical safety challenges that they have on the job.
One last thought is that what can retailers expect in terms of food supply issues in the short term, which is what we're seeing now, but long term, what kinds of changes can we expect to see in the supply chain? as we emerge from this coronavirus, hopefully sometime soon?
I think in the short term, we covered a couple of these topics. We will see lower variety. We will see some quantity challenges, and we will see some stockouts. We may also see some price increases in terms of the availability. As with reduced supply, you'll see an increase in price. I think that's natural for a lot of the processors and or the producers to get at least some of their investment back for their organization. When we start to talk about the future, and obviously our hope, as with everybody else, is that we get there sooner than later, is that number one, that we have transparency and visibility within the supply chain so we can anticipate and ensure that along the supply chain, we've got the appropriate steps on risk and resiliency, and that is evaluating what types of risks these organizations are going to face in the future. Yes, this is a black swan event. This is once in a 100-year type activities, but the devastation or the risk of not preparing for this type of disruption, I think we're all seeing how just pervasive the impact is across economies and across the globe. So we'll see quite a bit more on transparency and visibility. I think we'll also see some investment in agility. And this is a partnership that has to be with public-private stakeholders, identifying how agile do we need to be to respond to spikes or in demand or in supply shortages. This particular disruption was not in anybody's playbook. And I think that's what's caught everybody by surprise. We've had environmental risks before. We've had environmental disruptions. We've had terrorism disruptions. We've had a host of disruptions in the past. And the supply chain has, and the professionals have devised ways to respond to those. We'll devise ways to respond to this. And with a focus on ensuring that we have the agility to respond to the challenges and that we have the resiliency to ensure that we can maintain our food supply irrespective of the type of disruption. So this pandemic obviously has highlighted a lot of the benefits of supply chain in terms of addressing needed supplies across the economy, but it's also identified the fragility of the supply chain as well, whether we're talking about personal protection equipment or food. We're recognizing that we had an extremely efficient and effective supply chain prior to the pandemic, and we're seeing what a disruption in one of the inputs can have, whether it be supply or labor. We're seeing a significant impact. And so as we start to look towards the future, there'll be quite a bit of discussion and dissection of the decisions and the actions that we've taken. And I fully expect supply chain professionals and the industries that they serve will respond appropriately to these types of disruptions in the future. Obviously, it's impossible to predict what every disruption is going to be, but what we're seeing and the actions that organizations are taking to ensure that we provide the necessary products and services for the consumers and the patients is top of mind to every employer and every employee. And my hat's off to those individuals that are continuing to work through this pandemic and putting not only their organizations, but their personal welfare on the line. My hat's off to every healthcare worker as well as frontline worker.
That's great. That seems like a good point for us to wrap up. I just wanted to ask you if you had any other words for the grocery retail industry from the Association for Supply Chain Management.
Yeah, I think as we evaluate getting out of this disruption, I think we'll spend quite a bit more time on risk and resiliency and identifying what are those critical elements that we need to ensure that are of national interest and national security. And I think everybody would agree that our food supply chain is of the utmost criticality for our consumers and patients alike. I fully expect organizations as well as supply chain professionals to take up the challenge on how to respond in the future to these types of disruptions. The organizations are responsive, supply chains are responsive. We can see this as really the backbone of the economy. Our healthcare workers and healthcare facilities and our government agencies will ensure that we have a safe and healthy work environment and that we're all complying with it. Supply chain will ensure that we have a healthy economy, that we can get back to work and ensure that we're able to take care of our families and take care of our loved ones the way that we expect to. So I'm looking forward to not only putting this disruption behind us, but more importantly, identifying the things that we can do as an industry to respond to the challenges that we face today and in the future.
Great. Well, we've been talking today with Abe Eshkenazi, the CEO of the Association for Supply Chain Management. I'm Mike Browne with Supermarket News. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael.